ester names are comprised of two different words, and the words are based on the acid and the alcohol that were used to synthesize the ester. So that's why it's important to know which part of the ester came from the acid and which part came from the alcohol. And the first word comes from the alcohol part, and it ends in -il. So if the alcohol had one carbon, then the first part of the word would be methyl. If the alcohol that formed the ester had two carbons, then the first part of the name would be ethyl, etc. And the way I remember that is I think I got -il from alcohol. So the -il part of the name always comes from the alcohol. The second part of the name comes from the carboxylic acid, and rather than ending in the -ic that an acid ends in, it ends in -ate. And I remember this by I ate acid, which if you eat an orange, you do. Alright, so let's look at some examples. And one of the confusing things, well, maybe not confusing, but just you have to keep in mind is the way that ester structures are drawn. Typically, the segment that is derived from the carboxylic acid is drawn on the left or first, and the segment that comes from the alcohol is drawn second or on the right. But in the name, the part that comes from the alcohol comes first, and the part that comes from the acid comes second. So we just have to be aware of that. So if we look at our first example on the left here, and we identify the part of this ester that came from the carboxylic acid, it's always the carbonyl group as well as the R group. There are two carbons here, so that means it comes from acetic acid. Now, IUPAC nomenclature would be ethanoic acid, but I know of no person on this planet that actually uses that name. It's always called acetic acid. So this part comes from the acid, I ate acid, so this is going to be acetate, and it's going to be second. The part from the acid comes second. Then the part of this ester that comes from the alcohol has two carbons, so that would be ethyl alcohol. So ethyl, the section from the alcohol, comes first, and then acetate, part from acetic acid, goes second. Now let's look at our other example. Identify the part of the molecule or the ester that comes from the carboxylic acid, carbonyl carbon, and the R group. So this is derived from benzoic acid. So I ate an acid. So benzoic acid, when it is part of an ester, that acid part becomes benzoate. So that'll be the second part of the name because the acid comes second. And I look at the part of the ester that came from the alcohol. The O singly bonded to that carbonyl carbon, and it's R group. The R group has one carbon, so that's methyl alcohol or methanol. So methyl benzoate. So it will take some practice, and give yourself some time to consider when you look at the structure of an ester. Identify which part came from the acid, that comes second in the name and ends in -ate, and identify which part of the structure comes from the alcohol, that comes second in the structure but first in the name and ends in -il. And I always count carbons. That seems to help me when I'm trying to figure out the part, the name. I look how many carbons. One carbon, methyl. Two carbons, ethyl. Three carbons, propyl, etc.